The Survivor's Testament. In the spring of 1921, a British-led mountaineering expedition departed from Darjeeling with the express purpose of charting an unmapped Himalayan pass rumored to provide access to the northern approaches of the Great Peaks. 12 men set forth carrying theodolites, photographic equipment, climbing apparatus, and provisions for 6 weeks in the high country. What began as a routine surveying expedition transformed into something altogether more sinister, a descent into territory that mankind was never meant to trespass upon. The expedition encountered footprints of impossible dimensions, stone cairns marking forbidden ground, and the unmistakable presence of something watching from the ridgelines. By the expedition's end, only one man returned to civilization to bear witness to what transpired in those desolate valleys. This is his account, transcribed from journals and testimony given in the months following his solitary return. Before we proceed further into this narrative, I must impress upon the reader that what follows is not sensationalism, nor the fevered imaginings of a mind undone by altitude and privation. Every detail herein has been corroborated against my field notes, photographic plates, those few that survived, and the testimony I provided to the Royal Geographical Society. Testimony that was subsequently classified and sealed from public view. We departed Darjeeling in late spring, when the worst of the monsoon rains had passed, but the high valleys still held deep snow. The journey to the trailhead consumed a fortnight, our caravan winding through tea plantations that gave way to pine forests, then rhododendron groves, and finally the barren approaches to the true mountains. The air grew thinner with each passing day, each breath requiring conscious effort, as though one's lungs had to relearn their fundamental purpose. Our party numbered 12 souls at the outset. Major Edmund Harrington Smythe commanded the expedition, a veteran of the Survey of India, a man whose tidy notebooks and meticulous field observations had earned him considerable reputation amongst geographical circles. His bearing was military, his expectations absolute. He carried with him brass field glasses of remarkable quality and a leather-bound journal in which he recorded barometric readings, temperatures, and geological observations with unwavering regularity. Mr. Reginald Cartwright served as our expedition naturalist, a Cambridge-educated zoologist who had published papers on Himalayan fauna and possessed an insatiable curiosity for anything that walked, flew, or crawled in these mountains. His collection cases contained vials of preserving fluid, specimen jars, and instruments for measuring and cataloging the natural world. Cartwright approached the expedition with the enthusiasm of a schoolboy on holiday, utterly convinced he would discover species unknown to Western science. Dr. Nathaniel Bowes, our expedition physician, carried a comprehensive medical kit and an air of quiet competence that inspired confidence amongst the men. Half English, half Bengali, Bowes spoke the local dialects with native fluency and possessed an understanding of mountain medicine that would prove invaluable in the weeks ahead. His dark eyes missed little, and he possessed a rare ability to diagnose ailments before symptoms became critical. Our Sherpa guide, Dorje Lama, came highly recommended by the mountaineering community in Darjeeling. A man in his 40th year, whether by decade in the high country, Dorje possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of these valleys and, more importantly, an understanding of which places were sacred and which were best avoided entirely. His face bore the deep lines of constant exposure to sun and wind, and his eyes held a wariness that I would come to understand only too well. Pemba Sherpa and Tsering Sherpa, two powerful men from the Khumbu region, serve as our primary load carriers. Both had summit peaks that would make lesser men weep with terror, and both move across ice and rock with the confidence of mountain goats. They spoke little English, but communicated volumes through gesture and expression. Mingma, our expedition cook, was a slight man who could conjure remarkable meals from the most meager provisions. He carried his pots and utensils with the care most men reserve for religious relics, and his ability to brew tea under the most adverse conditions became a source of comfort in the difficult days ahead. 3 additional porters, Nima, Pong, and On Dorje, completed our support staff. Young men all, eager for the wages such expeditions provided. They would come to regret their decision to join our venture into the Forbidden Valleys. Finally, there was myself, Lieutenant William Ashford Gray, lately of His Majesty's Royal Engineers, seconded to the Survey of India for geographical reconnaissance. I carried surveying equipment, a Thornton Pickard folding camera, with 24 glass plates, and a service revolver that I sincerely hope would never be required. My role was to map what we crossed, document our route with photographs, and assist Major Harrington Smythe with celestial observations and triangulation measurements. We possess a permit stamped with official seals in a frontier office, along with letters of introduction and official assurances of safe conduct. Yet paper carries little weight in the high country, where authority derives not from distant governments, but from the mountains themselves and those who dwell amongst them. Our objective lay beyond a glacier on the northern approaches to the main Himalayan ridge, a high cirque where, according to an elderly monk who had confided in Dorje, an ancient pass existed that would provide access to the Tibetan plateau. The monk had spoken a line of stones marking a forgotten route, a way through the mountains used in centuries past but long since abandoned. Major Harrington Smythe believed such a pass, if it existed, might serve subsequent climbing expeditions seeking northern approaches to the Great Peaks. Cartwright hoped to document high-altitude flora and fauna in regions seldom visited by Europeans. I harbored simpler ambitions: to map uncharted territory, reach the cirque, and return home in one piece with photographs and survey data that would advance geographical knowledge. The air thinned progressively as we gained altitude, each day requiring longer rest periods and more frequent halts. We maintained a measured pace, keeping individual loads modest to prevent altitude sickness and exhaustion. By midday, the men would chew dried apricots and speak in monosyllables, conserving energy for the afternoon's march. The silence of the high country pressed upon us. Not the comfortable quiet of lowland forests, but an oppressive absence of sound that made one acutely aware. The first monastery we encountered stood upon a precipitous ledge overlooking a horseshoe of peaks. Prayer flags snapped in the constant wind, their colors faded by sun and weathered a pale ghost of their original vibrancy. An elderly monk emerged as we approached, his robes tattered, his face deeply lined. He pressed his forehead to Dorje in greeting, then regarded Major Harrington Smythe and myself without the slightest trace of warmth or welcome. Dorje translated the old man's words, his voice carrying a note of concern that had been absent during our journey thus far. The monk spoke of the higher valleys with unmistakable dread. He said those places were watched by a presence, something that did not welcome intrusion. Hunters had vanished there during storms that never descended to the lower slopes. Shepherds who ventured too high with their flocks returned with tails of eyes watching from the ridgelines and sounds that no animal of their acquaintance could produce. Major Harrington Smythe thanked the monk with characteristic politeness and offered him tea from our stores. The old man refused the tin with a sharp gesture and retreated into his monastery without another word, without a backwards glance, as though he had already been consigned to some inevitable fate, and he wished no further association with our doomed enterprise. I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the altitude. Something in the monk's eyes, not fear precisely, but profound sadness, as though he had seen the story unfold before and knew how it would end. The track wound around a black moraine and entered a basin of gray scree and blue-white ice. Our boots sank with each step, making progress exhausting. Patches of lichen clung to rocks, and I paused periodically to photograph the terrain and make sketch maps of our route. A hare bolted from behind a boulder, its white coat perfect camouflage against the snow, and vanished amongst the rocks with astonishing speed. Cartwright pointed out a herd of barrel, the blue sheep of the high Himalayas, far up on a distant ridge, and made excited notations in his field book about their altitude and behavior. By late afternoon, we reached a shelf of level ground beside a frozen tarn. The wind, which had harried us all day, suddenly died away completely. The cold intensified immediately, seizing through wool and canvas, as though these materials offered no protection whatsoever. Mingma lit our small kerosene stove, and we gathered around its meager warmth, eating rice and drinking tea fortified with a small portion of dried yak meat. The sky above appeared hard and crystalline, devoid of clouds. Stars began appearing even before the sun had fully set, an indication of the extreme altitude we had attained. I slept fitfully in my sleeping bag, dreaming formless dreams that evaporated upon waking, leaving only a vague sense of unease. Dawn brought thin light and bitter cold. Mingma was first to venture from his tent, intending to melt snow for morning tea. His sharp intake of breath brought the rest of us stumbling from our shelters, still half asleep but instantly alert to potential danger. Prints marked the snow near the tarn's frozen edge, enormous impressions set wide apart, far exceeding the stride length of any man. The tracks were crisp and fresh, with clearly defined edges indicating they had been made during the night, whilst we slept mere yards away. Each print showed remarkable anatomical detail, a deep heel impression, 5 distinct toes, and a ball of the foot that had pressed into the frozen crust with considerable weight. The space in between prints suggested a bipedal gait, yet the stride length was impossible. No human being could step so far without running. These prints indicated steady walking, a calm and measured pace, as though whatever had made them had been in no particular hurry, unconcerned by our presence. Major Harrington Smythe knelt beside the prints, producing a measuring tape and notebook. He recorded dimensions with scientific precision, then made detailed sketches from multiple angles. His explanation came quickly, perhaps too quickly, as though he were convincing himself rather than informing us. He suggested these might be the prints of a Himalayan brown bear that placed its hind foot directly into its forefoot impression, creating the illusion of a single enormous print with human-like characteristics. George listened to this explanation in silence, his expression unreadable. Pemba studied the ridge lines rather than the prints, his jaw set, and pulled his scarf more tightly around his neck despite the relatively calm morning. Cartwright requested plaster of Paris to make casts of the prints. We carried none. The sun rose higher, its rays striking the prints directly, and within an hour the crisp edges had softened and detail had blurred. The evidence of our midnight visitor became increasingly ambiguous, until one could almost convince oneself that the prints were indeed some natural phenomenon rather than proof of something inexplicable moving through our camp whilst we slept. We struck camp and continued upward. No one articulated what we all felt, that the prints had been a warning, a sign that we had been observed and found wanting, that we were trespassing in territory where we had no rightful business. Midday brought thin clouds streaming over the peaks and dry snow carried on a rising wind. The path climbed past a frozen waterfall where green ice showed in layered bands, indicating years of accumulation. Sayering pointed toward a rock wall where small cairns stood at regular intervals, piles of stones clearly built by human hands, weathered by time until lichen had colonized their surfaces. The cairns formed a line leading toward the upper basin, marking a boundary. George's face grew grave as he examined them. These were not trail markers, he explained, but warning cairns, indicators of taboo ground, places where men should not venture without proper offerings and ritual preparation. He insisted we make offerings before proceeding further. Major Harrington Smythe, to his credit, did not scoff at this. He placed a silver coin beneath one of the cairn stones. I added a strip of cloth that had served as a bandage during our ascent. The Sherpas contributed rice grains, butter, and softly murmured prayers. We passed between the cairns in single file, maintaining respectful silence. The atmosphere changed perceptibly once we had crossed that threshold. The wind, which had buffeted us all morning, died away to absolute stillness, yet the weather on the lower slopes remained unchanged. We had entered a pocket of calm, a microclimate that defied meteorological logic. The air felt heavier somehow, pressing against the eardrums, making it difficult to hear clearly despite the absence of wind noise. By dusk, we reached the first of the upper meadows, though meadow hardly described the desolate expanse of broken slate and pale scree that stretched before us. No vegetation whatsoever grew at this altitude. The ground looked lifeless, sterile, a landscape from before the advent of organic matter. We erected 3 tents, 2 for the European members of the expedition, 1 larger shelter for the Sherpas and porters, and rigged a cooking area using canvas and poles. The kerosene stove provided minimal warmth. We each nursed 10 cups of tea, holding them close to our chests, absorbing what meager heat they offered before the liquid cooled to tepidity in the freezing air. That night brought the first truly inexplicable occurrence, something that could not be explained away as misidentified footprints or overactive imaginations. A sound moved through the camp, originating from somewhere beyond the ridge above us. It possessed a tonal quality unlike any natural phenomenon I had previously encountered. Not wind, not falling rock, not animal call. The sound held a steady fundamental frequency with complex overtones, rising and falling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, almost communicative. The volume was not overwhelming, yet the sound carried with perfect clarity through the still air. It continued for perhaps 5 minutes, modulating through variations before ceasing as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed felt oppressive, expectant, as though the mountains themselves were waiting for our response. Mingma's eyes had gone wide, showing white all around the iris. Dorj sat perfectly still, listening with complete concentration, his face betraying nothing of his thoughts. The other Sherpas exchanged glances, but said nothing. What was there to say? We had all heard it. The sound had been real, undeniable, and utterly inexplicable. I lay awake for hours afterwards, straining my ears for any repetition. None came. Eventually exhaustion overcame apprehension, and I slept. Dawn broke clear and bitterly cold. I took the field glasses and scanned the ridge above our camp, the lenses trembling slightly in my half-frozen hands. Nothing moved on the skyline. The snowfield above us appeared pristine and undisturbed. Yet I could not shake the conviction that we were being watched, that every movement we made was being observed and assessed by intelligences we could neither see nor comprehend. We roped ourselves in pairs of crossing the upper snowfield, Major Harrington Smythe leading with Dorj, myself following with Cartwright. The rope ran cleanly through the snow, occasionally snagging on small drifts but otherwise gliding smoothly across the frozen surface. We reached a notch in the ridge and looked down into a bowl of blue glacier ice, perhaps half a mile in diameter. The bowl contained debris from an enormous rockfall that had sheared away part of the far wall, leaving fresh scar tissue on the mountain's face. Boulders the size of houses lay scattered across the ice, their edges sharp and angular, indicating relatively recent collapse. Near the center of the bowl, incongruous and deeply unsettling, lay a smashed prayer wheel, the type normally mounted on a post that spins freely in the wind, accumulating spiritual merit with each rotation. But no post stood anywhere nearby. The prayer wheel lay crushed and mangled, as though subjected to tremendous force. The metal cylinder was gouged and dented, the sacred inscriptions defaced and illegible. We cut steps across the bowl using our ice axes, moving with extreme caution on the slick surface. At the far side, we discovered a shelter built from stone slabs, a crude structure with a sagging roof that had partially collapsed. Inside, we found 3 yak skulls arranged in a row, a small hearth containing blackened stones, and on the ground, a child's leather shoe with cracked and deteriorated sole. Cartwright picked up the shoe with obvious reluctance, turned it over in his hands, then carefully replaced it exactly where it had lain. The shelter contained no bedding, no cooking implements, no tools. Nothing to indicate recent habitation, yet the atmosphere inside felt deeply wrong, as though something terrible had occurred here. A faint smell hung in the air, musky animal, but with undertones I couldn't quite identify. The scent was not fresh, yet it clung to the stones with stubborn persistence, as though the very rock had absorbed and retained it. Dorj stood at the shelter's entrance, watching the slope above with complete focus. Pemba traced a protective sign on the ground with his finger, then covered it with grit and small stones. No one spoke. The implications of that child's shoe, of yak skulls arranged with clear deliberation, pressed upon us with suffocating weight. We established camp in a hollow that offered some protection from wind. Major Harrington Smythe had a string of perimeter rope fitted with small brass bells around the tents, a warning system that would alert us to any approach, whether from wolf, bear, or human intruder. The Sherpas approved of this precaution, though I noticed they kept their ice axes close at hand, even whilst eating. That night the bells produced no clear ringing, yet something approached our camp nonetheless. Near dawn, a peculiar pressure descended, not physical exactly, but palpable nonetheless, like the sensation of a door closing in an enclosed room, changing the air pressure against one's eardrums. I woke completely and instantly, all traces of sleep vanishing. Footsteps moved through the snow outside the tent. One step, a long pause, then another step, slow, deliberate, unhurried. The bells on our perimeter, rope did not ring. Not a single chime broke the silence, despite the fact that anything large enough to leave those footprints should have struck or disturbed the rope. I held my breath and counted to 60, then to 100. The steps moved away toward the ridge, receding gradually until I could no longer hear them. I unzipped the tent flap with shaking hands and peered into the pre-dawn gloom. The snow surface lay smooth and unmarked within the perimeter of our bell rope. Yet beyond the rope, just inches from the bells themselves, a single enormous print had been pressed deep into the frozen crust. 5 toes showed clearly. The heel had sunk several inches into ice-hard snow, indicating tremendous weight placed with extraordinary care. When full daylight came, Major Harrington Smythe examined the print extensively. He searched for claw marks and found none. Bears possess prominent claws that leave clear striations in snow. This print showed only the impression of a flexible, gripping appendage with distinctly human-like characteristics. The Major set his jaw and announced we would pack immediately. We should reach the cirque by evening, he declared, and he saw no reason to linger in a camp where the ground offered poor protection, and something was clearly taking far too much interest in our presence. The men moved with remarkable speed, speaking only when necessary, communicating primarily through gestures and expressions. I found myself checking that single print every few minutes, half expecting it to have changed somehow when I looked away, to have multiplied or deepened or vanished entirely. The path narrowed into a gully with walls of fractured schist, where frost action had wedged the rock apart into loose, unstable slabs. We moved in single file, and small stones clattered down at our passing, the sound echoing between the gully walls. Halfway through this confined passage, Tsering suddenly hissed and raised his hand for silence. Above us, on the right wall of the gully, a dark shape withdrew from the rim. Something that had been watching our approach, observing us from above. The shape moved with absolute silence. No rocks fell, no stones were dislodged by its passage. The shadow simply flattened against the wall, then was gone, vanishing as though it had never been there at all. Major Harrington Smythe called up in a steady voice, using both Nepali and English. We meant no harm, he announced. We wished only to pass through. We carried food and tea that we would gladly share. His voice echoed off the gully walls and died away without response. George urged us forward without pause, his face grim. My mouth had gone completely dry despite the fact I'd been chewing snow periodically to stay hydrated. We pressed through the gully at maximum speed consistent with safety, expecting at any moment to have something drop upon us from above. We emerged into the upper basin without incident, but the tension remained. The cirque rose before us in 3 tiers of ice and rock, a natural amphitheater perhaps a mile across, ringed by walls of stone and ice that glittered in the afternoon sun. At the center of the cirque stood a platform built from flat stones, rising to waist height. The construction showed clear evidence of human agency. The blocks had been shaped and fitted with considerable skill. Upon this platform lay a ring of bones bleached to a pale color by sun and weather. The bones were not all from a single animal. I could identify yak, barrel, marmot, and other species I couldn't name. At the center of the bone ring stood a wooden spindle with a frayed cord hanging from it, swaying gently in the slight breeze. Cartwright reached toward the bones, scientific curiosity overcoming caution. George spoke a single sharp word, and Cartwright's hand froze mid-reach. Whatever this place was, it clearly served a sacred or ceremonial purpose. To disturb it would be the height of disrespect, potentially dangerous disrespect. We circled the platform cautiously. On the far side, a line had been drawn in the snow using ash or charcoal. The line ran from the platform toward a cleft in the back wall of the cirque, a dark opening perhaps 8 feet high and 4 feet wide. The ash had drifted and scattered somewhat, but still formed a discernible trail pointing toward that forbidding entrance. We followed the ash trail to the cleft. A cold current of air flowed from the opening, steady, odorless, carrying no scent of animal or decay. The gap led into a narrow defile that curved away into darkness beyond the reach of daylight. On the left wall, at approximately shoulder height, someone had scratched marks into the stone, sets of 3 parallel strokes spaced about 2 inches apart, repeated at intervals. The marks looked old but not ancient, and they descended deeper into the cleft as though marking a route. The floor of the defile held no footprints, no debris, no indication of what might dwell within. Yet from deep in the darkness came a sound of slow, rhythmic breathing that manifestly did not originate from any member of our party. Major Harrington Smythe raised his hand for absolute silence and held it aloft for a long moment. When he finally lowered his hand, his face had changed, the confident expression replaced by something harder, more cautious. He looked older somehow, as though he had aged years in moments. He announced we would not enter without preparation, planning, and adequate guards left at the camp. We were not equipped for spelunking, he stated, and the cleft clearly warranted systematic exploration rather than rash investigation. We returned to the basin and established camp near a bent boulder that provided a windbreak. Major Harrington Smythe outlined his plan with characteristic precision. 2 men would remain at camp with the bell rope and stove, maintaining a base of operations, for would scout the lower shelves of the cirque for alternative exit routes should we need to depart in haste. The remainder, led by Dorge, would enter the cleft equipped with oil lamps, rope, and my camera to document whatever lay within. He assigned me to the exploration party. I checked the camera and the spare glass plates, my hands trembling slightly until I forced them still through sheer will. The prospect of entering that dark cleft produced a peculiar combination of dread and anticipation. I feared what we might find, yet felt compelled to know, to document, to understand. We entered the cleft in single file, Dorge leading with an oil lamp, myself following with the camera equipment, Mingma third with an additional lamp and tea provisions, and Ong Dorge bringing up the rear with rope and pitons should we need to establish fixed lines. The stone walls narrowed until our shoulders brushed them on both sides. The light from our lamp smoothed into a dim glow that barely penetrated the darkness ahead. The air grew progressively colder, carrying no hint of smoke or combustion, indicating these passages had not been used for fires in recent times, if ever. The floor rose in small natural steps carved by ancient water flow, smooth and rounded. In places the rock bore a dull polish where countless hands had braced against the walls. The breathing sound we had heard from the entrance faded, then returned from a side passage, then faded again, creating the unsettling impression of tidal movement, of something vast and rhythmic beyond our comprehension. Dorge raised his hand and pointed to a shelf in the left wall. A length of hide had been wedged there, stiff and desiccated with age, bearing coarse hair that did not match yak, barrel, or any domestic animal of my acquaintance. The color fell somewhere between brown and gray, and the individual hairs were remarkably long and thick. I set up the camera with the folding tripod, opening the lamp's cowl to direct maximum light onto the hide. The exposure took 30 seconds, an eternity in that enclosed space, during which I held my breath and prayed nothing would move in the darkness beyond our lamplight. The hair showed a mixture of thick guard strands and finer underfur, indicating an animal adapted for extreme cold at high altitude. I carefully placed the exposed glass plate in a protective case, my fingers clumsy with cold despite the gloves I wore. The brass fittings of the camera had acquired the temperature of the surrounding air and burned with cold against exposed skin. The passage bent and widened into a flat area perhaps 20 feet across. At its center lay a circular pit lined with stones, a fire pit or offering basin. Inside we found ash and small fragments of bone. Dorge crouched and sifted through the ash with a twig, extracting several split seeds that had clearly been subjected to intense heat. Mingma leaned over the pit and frowned, troubled. He identified the seeds as belonging to a plant that grew exclusively at much lower altitudes, in the forested valleys far below our current position. The implications were deeply unsettling. Whatever used this place traveled across vast vertical ranges, carrying materials from the lowlands to these extreme heights for purposes we could not fathom. A dull knock echoed from ahead, not sharp like falling rock, but muted, deliberate. Dorge motioned for Ong Dorge to hold our rear position, whilst we advanced 3 paces. The knock repeated, spaced by several seconds. We turned a corner and discovered a large stone slab that had been moved aside many times. Worn grooves in the floor testified to repeated sliding. Beyond the slab lay a chamber, with a ceiling low enough that we had to stoop. The floor bore marks where something heavy had been dragged repeatedly. At the far end of the chamber, a curtain woven from dry grass hung across a niche in the wall. The grass had become brittle with age, cracking and fragmenting. Dorge murmured a prayer under his breath, barely audible, respectful, acknowledging that we had entered a space of significance. He crossed the chamber slowly and used his walking pole to lift the curtain. He stared into the niche for several heartbeats, then called me over without raising his voice. Inside the niche lay a collection of objects arranged with obvious care. 2 wooden bowls with sustaining their rims, a twisted bracelet of hammered copper, a child's cap with a faded tassel, a small ritual drum with its leather head worn through, and strips of parchment bound with cord, possibly prayers or sacred texts. I set up the camera again and worked in complete silence. The click of the shutter mechanism seemed obscenely loud in that enclosed space. I photographed the niche, then the drag marks on the floor, then the grooved stone slab. Each exposure felt like a transgression, a violation of something sacred, yet the scientific imperative to document overrode my qualms. We left the parchments undisturbed. Dorge stated we would return with Dr. Bowes, who might be able to read any inscriptions. He urged us forward whilst our lamp oil held. We took the right-hand tunnel, which sloped upward at a gentle angle. The air grew progressively stiller, our breathing the only sound. A scent reached us, the same musky odor we had encountered in the stone shelter, but stronger here, more recent. 30 paces brought us to a second chamber, significantly taller than the first, with a natural crack in the ceiling that admitted a thin shaft of daylight. Beneath this opening stood a pile of animal skins, yak, barrel, perhaps marmot, stacked with clear deliberation. The topmost skin bore impressions where teeth had pressed, not bite marks from feeding, but the pressure of jaws testing, examining. I moved to set up the camera, but Dorge touched my sleeve and pointed to the floor. A single hair lay across a small pebble near the skin pile, pale, almost white and extraordinarily long. The hair shifted in the slight air current from the ceiling vent. It measured longer than my hand from wrist to extended fingertip, far longer than any human hair I had ever encountered. A scraping sound came from behind us. Ong Dord called out in a tense whisper that something had moved near the chamber with the curtain. Dord signaled to reduce 2 of our lamps, leaving only one burning at minimal intensity. We stood in near darkness, straining our ears. The scraping did not repeat. The silence pressed upon us until I could hear the blood pulsing in my temples. My back muscles had gone rigid with tension, then gradually relaxed. I thought of the bell rope at our camp and wished desperately that I could hear its chiming. It would have represented distance, safety, human habitation. The thought passed. We had committed ourselves to exploration. We pushed deeper. We reached a narrow natural bridge spanning a deep crack in the floor. The width allowed only 1 foot at a time, and the darkness below was absolute. We crossed with extreme caution, testing each foothold before committing our weight. Beyond the bridge, the passage opened into a gallery perhaps 50 feet long, with ledges at varying heights on both walls. On these ledges lay stones arranged in clear patterns. Some formed spirals, others created geometric shapes. In one location, pebbles had been sorted by color from pale gray to dark gray to black, arranged in a curved row along the wall. The sight produced a profound change in my thinking. This was not random. This was not natural geological formation. This represented conscious arrangement, aesthetic choice, perhaps even art. The implications cascaded through my mind like an avalanche. If something possessed the cognitive capacity to create patterns, to sort by color, to arrange stones for purely aesthetic purposes, then we were dealing with intelligence, not merely an animal. Mingma voiced the question we all carried. Could shepherd children have created these patterns? Dorge shook his head firmly. No child would venture into these passages, he stated. No shepherd would permit it. These arrangements represented something else entirely, something we had no framework to understand. At the galleries, and we found an opening to the outside, small and roughly circular, carved by frost wedging and wind erosion over centuries. Through this opening we could see a notch in the ridge and a patch of sky. The light indicated midday had passed. Below the opening, the rock had been worn smooth by repeated contact with hands and feet. This was a vantage point, an observation post from which one could survey the basin below, whilst remaining hidden. Dorge leaned out carefully and scanned the area around our camp. His body went completely rigid. He gestured for us to approach one at a time and looked toward the bent boulder that marked our encampment. A figure stood near the boulder, perhaps 40 yards from our tents. It faced the camp directly and stood absolutely motionless. The shape appeared tall and broad across the shoulders, covered in fur that lay close to the body rather than hanging loose. I could not discern facial features from this distance, but the overall form was unmistakably bipedal, unmistakably humanoid in its general proportions. The men at camp, Tsering and Nima, left on guard, had not noticed a figure. Smoke from the cooking stove rose straight upward in the still air. The figure simply stood and watched. Then it turned its head and looked directly toward our vantage point. The movement was slow, deliberate, carrying unmistakable intent. The figure had known we were there. It had been aware of our observation, even as it observed our camp. I felt utterly exposed despite being concealed within the stone gallery. My throat constricted. Every instinct screamed at me to withdraw, to hide, to make myself as small and insignificant as possible. Dorj met my eyes, and I saw that he had reached the same conclusion. He announced we would leave immediately and return only with the full party, if we returned at all. We retraced our path through the gallery, across the bridge, past the chamber with the skins and the chamber with the niche. The patterns of stones remained undisturbed. The curtain in the chamber hung crooked, as though brushed by a large shoulder since our passage inward. The change was subtle but unmistakable. At the cleft entrance, daylight and cold air struck us simultaneously. We emerged into the basin to find Major Harrington Smythe waiting with Cartwright and Pemba at the perimeter rope. Tsering stood by the stove with the metal rod he'd been using to strike the bells at hourly intervals. Their expressions told us everything we needed to know before words were exchanged. They had seen movement. They had felt watched. Major Harrington Smythe approached briskly, field glasses still in hand, and demanded a report. Dorj provided it in clipped phrases. Niche with objects, skins, hair, stone gallery with patterns. Figure watching our camp from concealment. The figure had been aware of our observation. The Major's mouth compressed into a thin line. He issued orders immediately. We would not divide our party again. The bell rope would be doubled and reinforced. The tents would be moved closer to the boulder. Cartwright was to document everything we had seen in writing, then begin packing the most essential plates and notes so we could depart at first light. The men worked with focused intensity. I assisted with moving the tents, whilst Dorj and Pemba walked a wide circle around the entire camp, reading the snow for signs. They found tracks, a line of prints approaching from the upper slopes and terminating near the bent boulder. The stride varied considerably. In some places the toes had gripped the frozen crust, leaving pronounced ridges. The tracks approached to within yards of the bell rope, but never touched it, passing by with inches to spare. Tsering reported that the figure had stood within spitting distance for more than a minute. He had felt its presence, felt eyes upon his back, before he turned and saw it clearly. He had not struck the bell to raise an alarm because it seemed utterly pointless to summon what was already there, already watching. He spoke without embellishment, stating facts without attempting to dress them in comfortable explanations. By dusk, wind returned from the north, gusting and swirling. The kerosene stove sputtered, nearly extinguished, then caught again with a blue flame. Major Harrington Smythe called us together in a close group. He acknowledged that we had likely intruded into territory of profound significance to those who dwelt here, whether men or something that fell outside conventional definition. We would show proper respect and depart. We would not light large fires that might be interpreted as hostile signals. We would speak quietly. He established a watch rotation. 2 men on duty for 1 hour, then 1 hour of rest. We were to sleep in our outer clothing, boots loosened but not removed, ready to move at a moment's notice. His entire manner had transformed. The confident surveyor who had departed Darjeeling had been replaced by a man who understood he had made a profound miscalculation. He did not attempt to explain how the figure had approached to within yards of our bells without triggering a single chime. He did not insist these were simply bears or snow leopards. His hand trembled visibly as he wrote his journal, the pen nib catching and dragging during the first watch. I sat with Dorj in the lee of the boulder. The stove provided minimal glow. Snow hissed as it struck the canvas tent walls. Across the basin, the cleft gaped like a dark mouth in the mountainside. The sky showed a single bright star near the notch in the ridge. Dorj spoke in a low voice, telling me of his grandfather, who had worked as a trader carrying salt and tea across the high passes. The old man had once approached this valley decades earlier. He had seen stones arranged on a shelf, positioned low to ground in patterns he could not explain. Without understanding precisely why, he had turned back. He had chosen an alternative route and never returned by that path again. Dorj said he had thought of his grandfather's story when the elderly monk at the first monastery had warned us away. Then he fell silent, watching the darkness. Near midnight, the bells vibrated without producing clear ringing. A strange, muffled trembling of the rope. We all woke instantly. No one spoke. The sound came from beyond the boulder, not the rhythmic breathing from the cleft, but something slower, heavier, more deliberate. The rope shivered again, then went still. Sayering stood with his metal rod, ready but did not strike the bells. The snow outside our perimeter lay pristine and unmarked despite the rope's movement. When the sound ceased, a small stone rolled from the top of the boulder and struck the ground with distinct tap. The stone had not fallen due to wind. The air lay absolutely calm. Something had dislodged it deliberately. I felt the entire camp contract psychologically, drawing inward. I breathed through my nose, counting slowly to steady my hands. My eyes remained fixed on the section of rope that had moved. The night passed in excruciating increments, each minute stretching toward eternity. At first light, we found the stone that had rolled into camp. It was not native to the basin floor. The rock was darker than the local stone, smooth from glacier polish, clearly carried from higher elevations. Major Harrington Smythe examined it briefly, then set it aside without comment. Dorj and Pemba traced fresh prints that circled our entire camp and ended at a cluster of rocks. From that point, the snow showed only the smooth sweep of a body sliding down toward the glacier, as though something had lowered itself with extraordinary care and deliberation. The sight imposed profound silence on our group. Cartwright broke it by asking whether the prints matched earlier ones. Dorj confirmed they did. The stride pattern and anatomical details remained consistent. The toe impressions had pressed even deeper this time, suggesting either greater weight or more forceful placement. We ate hurriedly, barely tasting the food. Mingma burned extra tea leaves in the pot, and we drank the bitter liquid for whatever warmth it provided. Major Harrington Smythe ordered immediate camp striking. We would take the retreat route Cartwright had scouted the previous day, a narrow chute between ice walls that led to lower elevations. The men pulled at tent ropes and folded canvas with mechanical efficiency. My hands moved through familiar motions, tying knots, wrapping camera plates, stowing equipment, whilst my mind remained fixated on the figure by the boulder, on how it had turned its head toward our hidden vantage point. It had known we watched. That knowledge clung to me more. The retreat path descended through a narrow chute flanked by walls of blue ice. The snow crust broke beneath our boots, and we sank knee-deep with each step. The climbing rope kept us connected, preventing anyone from falling into hidden crevasses. At one point, a slab of ice cracked with sound like a rifle shot and slid several feet before stopping. Sayering steadied the rope line and swore, creatively in Nepali. We reached a broader shelf where the sky cleared momentarily, revealing a high ridge with massive cornice of overhanging snow ready to collapse. Major Harrington Smythe chose a route along the base of the slope, arguing that avalanche debris had already fallen here. The slope had expended its accumulated weight. Each step felt weighted with the awareness of thousands of tons of snow and ice poised above us. Halfway across, Pemba froze mid-stride and pointed upslope. On the ridge, positioned just below the cornice, a shape stood silhouetted against the sky. It remained absolutely motionless, looking down at us without apparent haste or concern. Dorj hissed at the men to continue walking without stopping. We maintained the rope tension and crossed the debris field one careful step at a time. I could feel observation pressing upon us throughout the entire traverse, the sensation of eyes tracking our every movement. When we reached the far side in relative safety, I looked back. The shape had vanished. No collapse, no sliding snow, only absence where something had stood moments before. By midday, we reached a hollow containing a frozen stream and stopped for brief rest. The air felt noticeably thicker, easier to draw into our lungs. The men dropped their loads and sat in exhausted silence. Cartwright opened his field notebook and wrote furiously, as though terrified the details might evaporate from memory if not immediately recorded. He asked Dorge what the local populations called such creatures. Dorge looked at the frozen ground for a long moment before speaking a single word: Yeti. He pronounced it without emphasis, as though the word required no additional weight or elaboration. Major Harrington Smythe scowled and instructed Dorge to keep such terminology out of any official reports. We needed facts, he insisted, not folklore or local superstition. Dorge met the Major's eyes, but offered no further comment. We pushed onward into the lower valley. The wind shifted, carrying a faint scent, sharp, musky, unmistakable. The same odor from the chamber. It clung to the air long after we had left the hollow behind. That evening we established camp beside a line of ancient cairns. The stones leaned with age, lichen covering their surfaces. Major Harrington Smythe observed they would mark our progress on future maps. Dorge warned us against moving or disturbing them. We strung the bell rope again. I attempted to rest, but the musky scent seemed to fill my nostrils even here. When I finally slept, I dreamed of the gallery, of stones arranged in spirals in careful hands, sorting pebbles by color, creating patterns for purposes I could not comprehend. The bells rattled once during the night. Major Harrington Smythe and Sayering rushed out with oil lamps raised. They found prints close to the rope, 2 sets this time, side by side. The snow showed tremendous weight pressed deep into the frozen surface. One set of prints crossed the other at an angle. We could not determine whether 2 individuals had arrived simultaneously or whether one had followed the other. Major Harrington Smythe struck the snow repeatedly with above his field glasses, cursing with uncharacteristic vehemence. He announced we would double our pace at dawn. We would pack in darkness and depart before first light. The following day, the men moved as though pursued by devils. The rope line pulled taut between us. We descended through a forest of rhododendron. The branches bare of leaves at this elevation, the twisted trunks creating gaps through which shadows could pass unobserved. Cartwright stopped abruptly and bent over a branch. He showed us coarsehair caught in the bark, pale strands, almost white, several inches long. He pocketed them before Major Harrington Smythe could voice objection. The sight brought no relief. If anything, it increased our anxiety. Whatever followed us could move through dense forest as easily as across open rock and ice. Late in the day, a storm descended with shocking speed. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes. The trail vanished beneath our boots within minutes. Dorge led with his walking pole, probing ahead for hidden hollows and unstable ground. The men muttered prayers under their breath, continuous streams of sacred words seeking protection from malevolent forces. We stumbled into a stand of fir trees and erected makeshift shelter using canvas stretched between trunks. The kerosene stove barely lit in the thin air. Smoke drifted low, making our eyes water. We huddled in our sleeping bags, conserving body heat. The wind howled above the forest canopy, but beneath the trees the air remained close and muffled. I closed my eyes and thought of the child's shoe in the chamber niche, of the copper bracelet. Someone had lived in that cleft once, or died there. The thought disturbed me more profoundly than the storm. During the night, I woke to the sound of a creaking. Initially, I dismissed it as branches bending under accumulated snow. Then I heard a sharp snap from beyond the stove's feeble glow, deliberate, purposeful. I reached for my oil lamp with trembling hands. A shadow crossed between tree trunks, tall, broad-shouldered, gone in an instant. I held my breath until my lungs burned. Moments later, another shape passed in the opposite direction. The snow muffled their footsteps, but I felt their weight transmitted to the frozen ground, a deep vibration more sensed than heard. I dared not move. I counted my own heartbeats until blood roared in my ears. When I finally slept again, I dreamed of heavy eyes watching me from absolute darkness. Dawn revealed our camp thoroughly trampled. Snow around the trees bore broad prints that circled us in overlapping loops. Some prints had been placed atop others, but the depth indicated multiple individuals of substantial weight. The bell rope hung slack, the knots carefully untied, picked apart as though by fingers possessing manual dexterity and deliberate intent. Major Harrington Smythe examined the rope in profound silence, his lips pressed into a bloodless line. No member of our party would have wasted time and energy untying complex knots during a storm. The implication was inescapable and terrifying. We struck camp with numb hands, working in silence. The men moved rapidly, heads down, avoiding eye contact. The descent path led to a gorge where ice formations hung from the cliffs like frozen waterfalls. Meltwater dripped continuously, refreezing into ridges and columns. The gorge floor was narrow and confined, boxed in by vertical walls. George organized us into 2 files to increase our speed. The sound of water echoed continuously, but above that came another noise. Faint at first, then increasingly clear. A low call, too deep for wind, too prolonged for any animal of my acquaintance. The call repeated 3 times, each repetition closer than the last. Sayering crossed himself and gripped his ice axe with white knuckles. Major Harrington Smythe raised his field glasses, but the cliff faces revealed nothing. We hurried through the gorge, our breath coming in ragged gasps from fear rather than exertion. When we finally emerged into an open valley, the sound ceased abruptly. The valley beyond contained a frozen river, flat and gray, stretching perhaps a mile across. We chose a far bank for our camp, a slope of fractured stone that offered some protection from prevailing winds. The stove produced smoke, but negligible warmth. Mingma cooked rice without speaking. Cartwright extracted the white hairs from his pocket and laid them on a metal plate for examination. They were longer than my hand from wrist to extended fingertips. The individual strands appeared too coarse for human hair, too fine for yak. He attempted measurements, but Major Harrington Smythe snapped at him to put the specimens away. We had no time for scientific curiosity, he stated. We had time only for survival. That night, watch duty fell to George and myself. The moon rose behind thick cloud, dim and hazy. We sat near the stove with lamps reduced to minimal glow. The snow field across the frozen river shone with faint luminescence. George touched my sleeve and pointed without speaking. A line of shapes moved slowly along the far bank. I counted 3 distinct figures, tall and broad, spaced widely apart. They walked with steady, deliberate gaits, heads inclined downward as though examining the ground. We watched in absolute silence until they reached the end of the visible river bend and disappeared behind an outcropping of rock. George leaned close and whispered that they would not stop following us now. His voice carried absolute conviction. At dawn, Major Harrington Smythe announced a significant change in plans. We would not follow the main track down the valley, he declared, but instead cut across the ridge to the south. The river path would leave us exposed and visible. George argued that the ridge route would slow our progress substantially, but the Major insisted. We began to climb. The slope rose steeply, with loose stone concealed beneath snow. Twice men slipped and slid backwards, saved from serious injury only by the climbing rope. By noon, clouds closed around us, hiding the peaks and reducing visibility to mere yards. We moved through a gray world of mist and snow, only the rope connecting us and our own labored breathing confirming we still existed. Then a cry broke the silence. High, sharp, utterly unlike the deep calls we had heard previously. The sound came from just ahead on the ridge. We froze in place. A shadow passed through the mist, moving with shocking speed. Stones rattled down the slope. Nima, positioned at the rear of our line, shouted in terror. We turned and saw him struggling. Something had seized his pack with tremendous force. The climbing rope pulled taut enough to hum. The pack tore free, spilling equipment and supplies down the slope, kettles, food bags, clothing, all cascading away into the mist below. The shadow vanished into clouds above us. Nima fell to his knees, shaking uncontrollably. His eyes were wide and wet with tears. He spoke no words, only clutched the rope as though it alone prevented him from falling into an abyss. We pressed onward, badly shaken. The pack and its contents were lost. Worse still, the kerosene stove had been in Nima's pack. We reached the saddle by dusk and built a miserable camp with no fire, subsisting on cold rations and melted snow. The men huddled together for warmth. Major Harrington Smythe attempted to give orders, but his voice had lost all authority. Cartwright spoke instead, his words quiet but firm. What we had witnessed could not be dismissed as bears or tricks of light and shadow, he stated. The gallery of arranged stones demonstrated clear evidence of cognitive thought and aesthetic sensibility. The figures on the river had moved with obvious purpose and intent. We were dealing with intelligent beings, not mere animals. His words shattered something in the group's cohesion. Men began arguing. Some wanted to turn back toward the upper valleys. Others insisted on continuing downward. Major Harrington Smythe shouted them into silence, but his shouts carried no weight. Authority had drained away, leaving only fear and confusion. During the night, I woke to low sounds, not quite growls, not quite vocalizations, but drawn-out tones from multiple throats. They came from both sides of the ridge simultaneously. Snow slid from above in sheets and cascades. The ground trembled subtly. I crawled from my tent and saw two shapes on the ridge crest, black silhouettes against the cloud-diffused moonlight. They stood motionless, observing our camp. Then one lifted its head and produced a call that rolled across the valley, deep, resonant, communicative. The sound froze me more effectively than the temperature. It conveyed a message. We were not leaving unnoticed. We were being watched, tracked, followed. Our departure was permitted but monitored. At dawn, no prints remained visible on the crest. Fresh snowfall had covered them. Major Harrington Smythe ordered us to move without food, without tea, without any delay whatsoever. We descended the south slope into a forest of pine trees. The air smelled of resin and damp earth. The ground showed no snow here, only needles and moss. For a brief period, I allowed myself to believe we had escaped. Then Pemba stopped abruptly and raised his hand. Ahead, placed conspicuously on a fallen trunk, lay the copper bracelet we had seen in the chamber niche. It had not been in anyone's pack. We had left it untouched in the cleft. Yet here it lay, clean and bright on the weathered bark, placed deliberately where we would find it. The men recoiled as though from a serpent. Mingma muttered that it had been carried and placed specifically for us, a message, a warning, a demonstration. Major Harrington Smythe cursed and kicked the bracelet into the brush, but the act provided no comfort. We marched onward. I kept looking backward. The trees closed around us, pressing inward. The air grew oppressive. I heard twigs snapping behind us. Never close, always just beyond visual range. The forest was not empty. We knew this with absolute certainty. We also knew we could not outpace what followed us. We continued through the pine forest until our legs buckled with exhaustion. Major Harrington Smythe finally called a halt in a hollow where boulders provided cover on three sides. The men dropped their loads in silence. No one dared gather firewood despite the cold. We chewed dry grain and drank melted snow captured in the folds of our coats. Hunger pressed upon us, but no one complained. Each man kept glancing toward the trees, watching for movement. I thought continuously of the bracelet on the trunk. That it followed us in the cleft to this forest indicated more than simple pursuit. It demonstrated intention, communication, perhaps warning. Cartwright broke the silence, voicing what we all thought but had not articulated. These beings, he refused to call them beasts, were not animals but people of some kind, living beyond the boundaries of known human civilization. Their actions, laying stones in patterns, leaving objects as messages, were signs of order and intelligence, not instinct. Major Harrington Smythe told him to hold his tongue. To suggest such things was to surrender to fear and superstition, he insisted. Yet Harrington Smythe's own hand trembled as he wrote in his notebook. I saw the ink trail crookedly when the pen nib caught on the page. His eyes had gone dull, the confident gaze of a surveyor replaced by the haunted look of a man who understands he has made a catastrophic error of judgment. At dusk, Tsering struck the bell rope as ordered, but the sound rang flat and died quickly. The men turned their heads as one. In the trees beyond our hollow, something moved, not one individual, but many, shifting between trunks, visible for instants before disappearing. Broad shoulders, arms that hung longer than human proportions, bodies taller than any man in our party. I counted 4, possibly 5, before the trees swallowed them. They did not approach closer. They circled, maintaining distance, watching. My mouth went completely dry. Major Harrington Smythe whispered for everyone to remain still. No panic, no shouting, no sudden movements. We sat through the night with the rope gripped in our hands. The shapes never entered our perimeter, but they remained present. I knew they watched continuously until the first pale light filtered through the branches. When morning came, the men refused to move immediately. George stated that the path south would bring us to a village in 3 days if we maintained good pace, but the men shook their heads. We would not survive 3 days with shadows at our heels, they insisted. Major Harrington Smythe attempted to argue, but his voice cracked mid-sentence. Pemba spoke the group, proposing we leave gifts and turn back eastward where the valleys opened wider. The spirits, or whatever they truly were, would allow us to depart if we showed proper respect. Cartwright agreed, though for different reasons. These were not spirits, he maintained, but beings who guarded their territory. Trespassers must pay tribute to be permitted safe passage. We gathered what little we could spare from our dwindling supplies. A knife, a wool scarf, a tin cup, a string of beads, a strip of dried meat. We laid these offerings on a flat stone at the hollow's edge. George murmured words in a language I did not recognize. Prayers or entreaties, low and clear, the air still completely. No bird calls, no crackling branches, no wind. The silence grew until it became physically painful. Then from deep within the trees came a short call, low, rough, brief. Once, then nothing more. George nodded and told us to move eastward. The men obeyed immediately. Major Harrington Smythe bit his lip until it bled, but did not countermand the order. We crossed a low ridge and entered a gorge where water had carved through solid rock over millennia. The walls pressed close, the air damp and heavy with moisture. I walked near the rear of our line. The rope pulled hard at times as men ahead increased their pace, desperate to escape confinement. Then a cry rang out from above the gorge, sharp, violent, cutting through stone. A shadow dropped on the path ahead, landing in complete silence despite the tremendous impact. Ice cracked beneath its weight. It rose to full height, broad chest, arms swinging long and powerful, hair pale gray against the dark rock, eyes deep set and intensely dark. It stared at us without making a sound. The men froze. No one drew weapons. Major Harrington Smythe stepped forward with his hand raised, his lips moving in words I could not hear over the rushing in my ears. The figure held perfectly still. Then another dropped behind us. The rope went taut enough to sing. I turned and saw the second one, darker in coloration, thicker in build, its breath rising in clouds of condensation. We were boxed in. The air thickened with palpable fear. I felt my knees weaken, my vision narrowing. My mind screamed to flee, but the gorge walls held us imprisoned. The first one produced a sound like a bark, short, sharp, final. It took a step closer, slow and measured. Major Harrington Smythe shouted now, his voice breaking, calling a beast, calling it nothing but a brute animal. His hand went to his service revolver. George grabbed his arm and held it down with surprising strength. Harrington Smythe fought him, face flush red, the figure's eyes fixed on the Major with an intensity that suggested complete understanding. The silence following the shout felt endless. Then the second figure moved, circling closer with predatory grace. Cartwright cried out for us to leave more gifts. He fumbled in his coat for the hair samples he collected, his notebook, specimen vials. He held them out with violently shaking hands. The first figure turned its head toward Cartwright. It stepped backwards. The second followed suit. Without another sound, both creatures climbed the gorge wall, pulling themselves up with impossible ease, fingers and toes finding holds in seemingly smooth rock. They vanished into mist. We stood frozen long minutes after. George finally hissed for us to move. We stumbled forward without order or formation, tripping over rocks, breath coming in ragged gasps. The men looked utterly broken, eyes hollow and haunted. Major Harrington Smythe walked last, lips moving continuously in what might have been prayer or madness. His notebook remained clutched in one hand, his revolver holstered. No one spoke to him. Authority had evaporated completely. That night we found a meadow with low grass and streams free of ice, a sign we had descended to more hospitable elevations. The men dropped where they stood and lay motionless. We did not string the bell rope. We did not attempt to light a fire. The silence of the gorge confrontation had followed us here. I felt the weight of observation, even in this open space. I knew they could follow if they wished. I wondered whether they had deliberately allowed us to live, or whether they merely waited for us to break some final unknown rule. I stared at stars until exhaustion closed my eyes against my will. When I woke, I heard nothing. No men stirring, no breathing, no movement. The meadow lay deathly still. My stomach clenched with premonition. I sat up abruptly. Only Dorge remained, sitting by the cold fire pit, staring at the ground with empty eyes. He said nothing when I asked questions. His expression told me everything. The others were gone. Completely, utterly gone. No footprints, no cries, no evidence of struggle. Vanished. Major Harrington Smythe's notebook lay near the ashes, pages torn free and scattered. Cartwright's pack stood open, the hair samples removed. The meadow felt empty in a way that tore at the soul. Dorge whispered that we were not meant to take anything from that place. Not meant to write, not meant to study, not meant to document. We were meant to respect and depart. We had failed. We left the meadow without words. The path eastward led us back towards settlements and civilization. Days later, when stone walls of village rose before us, we looked back once. The peaks lay under perpetual cloud, unmoved and unchanged by what had transpired. Dorge did not enter the village with me. He turned and walked back toward the ridges, stating he owed a debt and intended to pay it. I never saw him again. I reached Darjeeling alone months later, walking the final miles in a daze of exhaustion and trauma. The men were never found despite search parties sent into lower valleys. The region remained unmapped, officially too dangerous for further surveying. The records we had carried were confiscated and sealed by authorities who asked questions I could not adequately answer. Major Edmund Harrington Smythe, Mr. Reginald Cartwright, Dr. Nathaniel Bowes, Mingma, Pemba, Tsering, Nima, Pong, On Dorge. Their names exist now only in my memory and in sealed files gathering dust in some government archive. What followed us in those high places had claimed them. I survived, but I carry the weight of their absence and the knowledge that something far greater than human understanding guards those heights. The stone gallery with its spirals and sorted pebbles haunts my dreams. The breathing from deep within the cleft echoes in my memory. The figure by the boulder, turning its head to look directly at our hiding place, demonstrates an intelligence we are not prepared to acknowledge. I have submitted my testimony. It has been dismissed as altitude sickness, as trauma-induced delusion, as the ramblings of a man broken by privation and loss. Perhaps that judgment brings comfort to those who read my words from the safety of London clubs and Cambridge colleges. But I know what I saw. I know what we encountered. And I know that some boundaries are drawn not by governments or geographical societies, but by those who were there first and intend to remain undisturbed. The Himalayas keep their secrets well. The Yeti, if that is a word we must use, guard their territory with intelligence, patience, and an understanding of human behavior that suggests long observation of our kind. We were permitted to leave. Most of us paid for that permission with our lives. I paid with my sanity and my reputation. This account will be filed away, forgotten, dismissed. Perhaps that is for the best. Some knowledge is not meant for the world. Some places are forbidden for reasons we cannot comprehend until we trespass and face the consequences. I will never return to those high valleys. I will never again look upon those peaks without remembering what watches from the ridgelines, what arranges stones and spirals, what breathes the darkness of ancient clefts. They are there still. They were there long before us. They will remain long after humanity has forgotten how to find them. This is my testimony. This is my warning. This is my confession. May God forgive us for our intrusion, and may those we lost find peace in whatever realm claims them now. Lieutenant William Ashford Gray, formerly of His Majesty's Royal Engineers, sole survivor of the 1921 Himalayan Expedition, Darjeeling, October 1921. End of account.